Okay, you'll see a picture. If you were joining us today, I suspect the view wouldn't be very different from that. Actually, you'd be walking along the street to the Insight Institute, and it gives us a bit of a pang. It's now coming up for a year since I was there teaching, and that's part of the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow with the characteristic Glasgow winter grey. I'm going to, you'll see I've given this the title Pracademia. That's a bit of a pretentious term, so forgive me. I got it from, there's more than one article about mediation in universities, mediation in academic life, where the person writing it has described themselves as a pracademic. What they mean by that is they both practice and they write about their practice in a nutshell. And when I was thinking about the clinic for this, and I recently wrote a paper for a Dutch magazine, journal I should say, which is in your pack, it struck me that the clinic in a way is pracademia. It's not just one individual, it's actually an attempt to take the academy, if you like, that's again a posh term for academic endeavour, universities, into society, but also to bring society into the academy. So that's really going to be my theme. I'm actually going to start with a little bit of my story. I began mediating in this city. Here's another view of Glasgow just recently, but as you can see, it's an industrial city, a post-industrial city, and I began my career in mediation as a family mediator. And the reason I want to share this is because I think it was a fantastic privilege. I think I was very, very lucky because of the intensity of that work. I was dealing with some, as you can imagine, in family mediation, some very sad people, some very angry people, some very bruised people, and some people who had been genuinely hurt physically by their former partners. I had to learn how to deal with that whole array of people. But on the other hand, I also saw parents who had been through a difficult experience of separation find a way to work together in parenting their children and leave our service on reasonable terms. And some of those people I would still bump into in the street or in the supermarket, who'll say, oh, that, you know, I'm glad we had that episode. I was at my children's wedding recently. That was always the mark of effective family mediation, is can the two of you be there when your children walk down the aisle? Now, I say that because I think that was what I'm going to call an apprenticeship of identity. I think in that period, that was mostly in the 1990s and 2000s, I was not only learning techniques, which I certainly had to learn, and there's no doubt about that, I was also learning how to be a mediator. And I think that has been one of the influences on the mediation clinic. And I want to say a couple more things just before we move on about that practice and about my formation. Two people stand out. One is a woman called Moira Monroe, who I shared an office with. She was a good bit older than me, had been around the block, but Moira had astonishing patience for me coming out of a mediation session and wanting to blurb. You'll never guess what they said. And year on year, I think that experience of chewing over things that went right, things that went wrong, things that you questioned with somebody who did the same work was fantastically helpful in building this apprenticeship of identity, helping me to sift what works from what doesn't work. What do I want to do? What do I want to be? you can probably see the influence in the clinic if you've got anything to do with it. The other person who had a huge influence was the manager of the service, a man called Walter Nicol. And I particularly think of him when I think of some of our most difficult clients. There were one or two people, men I have to say, who we had been told, perhaps by their ex-partner, that they had been on the receiving end of threats. And some of these, one or two of these guys would turn the threats on us. And I remember the sense that Walter had my back, the sense that you were part of something that, where there was somebody who would draw some lines and say, I'm sorry, we can't do that. You can't go any further. That's the end of the matter. That was astonishingly helpful for me as a relatively new mediator, as a relatively young mediator. And just one final thing that Walter did for me, after I'd been mediating for a couple of years and muddling through, shall we say, you know, always feeling, am I doing this right? I remember he brought me into his office and he said, we're going to do a presentation. I'm going to do a presentation for, I can't remember, a local university course. Would you like to take part in that? And I remember sitting in his office thinking, you think I can do this? And I think that, as much as anything, was actually one of the reasons why that went from being, at that time, I think I was still a sessional mediator, it became a career. So all of those influences, I think, have gone into the mediation clinic, and they've made me who I am. I'll not go into the whole story, more of it is in the article. What I'm going to do then, I want to cover 4 things in this talk. I'd like to look at triggers, and I'll explain that in a second. I want to look at environment. I want to talk about the justice system, and I want to talk about the model, the clinic model. And triggers is really, why are we doing it? Why are you doing it? Where are you located? Who are you serving? And both, how does it work? And then, of course, does it work? So let's get into this. I'm going to start, first of all, by why start a mediation clinic? What on earth? What on earth possessed me and us? Well, I'm going to try to make this look as unstrategic as possible. And I'm doing that, I think, to try to play into the strengths of mediators. I think mediators are not particularly planners. I think we tend to be people who are better at responding to unfolding situations than planning and mapping everything out in advance. And I would own that. I would own that in a big way. So I have to admit there's a big dollop of synchronicity in the fact that we have a clinic at all. This was not a master plan, I have to be honest. And the first trigger was, in fact, the students themselves. No sooner had I started in 2010, the mediation masters I teach in Strathclyde has a practice component. So as well as learning theory, students have an opportunity to practice, to do role plays essentially, and build their skills, learning by doing, as we're saying today. Very, very quickly, I think before the first weekend was over, people were saying, how do I get more experience? How do I see what this is like in real life? And certainly by the time the second weekend was over and they had the course behind them, that demand was pretty insistent. So that was one trigger, that if you're learning mediation, I think it makes little sense unless you get a chance to see it in the real world. And I'm not dismissing role play. I think role play is very, very useful. I'll say more about the difference in a moment. The second trigger, I've called it, it was imitation, the sincerest form of flattery. I was imitating other mediation clinics. I hadn't heard of them at this point, but I took students to a mediation competition in Liverpool, and the winners of the competition, I don't think they'll be blushing too much to hear me say that they were not only the best mediators, they were the most tanned and they looked the best. They were a Californian team. And I thought, they're really good. I mean, I watched some of that. I think I marked one of their rounds. I thought they really know what they're doing. And I spoke to their coach and I said, how come? How have you got the students to such a level of skill? And he said, oh, they're all in the clinic. They're mediating. They're mediating week in, week out in Southern California in the court system. And so another penny dropped. I think, though, I would be a little bit more principled and say that once I had that realization this was a good idea, I think that apprenticeship of identity idea also drove me. The sense that those who are going to be mediators, we all benefit from learning in a setting, and that setting includes people. That setting, it must include clients. We are engaging, and I think one of the important things about this is it is more than technique. I think I want to say something about raising the emotional stakes changes what you do. Now, role plays can be quite unnerving and people are anxious, and certainly I learned a lot from the role plays I did before I came face to face with real people. But there's something about raising the emotional stakes. The first time I sat in front of a couple who had just separated and were talking about their child, I think they had one child from memory, they ran rings around me. We were supposed to have an hour and a half and the session lasted 3 hours because the woman felt she had more to say. Now, not for the first time, I learned the important lesson that these good people were not going to let my ineptitude stand in the way of their getting a deal. They did eventually, didn't that first session they did eventually reach some agreement with each other. It was unnerving. It was in the days before pre-mediation. But what I'm saying is that when we start operating in the real world, it's technique, but it's also who we are. You cannot avoid that conclusion, I think, as a mediator, that the person you are is implicated in the work that you do. And I would go a bit further to say that has an ethical component. I'm not going to tap into the clinical legal education literature in this talk. Some people here today will be much more expert in that than I, and I think one of the workshops later will be touching on that with Ben Waters and Liz Hardy. However, what I do know is that clinical legal education, law clinics, are very concerned about producing more ethical lawyers. And I think similarly, there's something about operating in this setting. We're operating for free. We're usually dealing with people who are not particularly powerful or well off, or sometimes one is and one isn't. And that statement, what do I do now? It conveys something of my own view about mediation ethics. They are very, very much in the moment. The moment when you make the wrong decision and the moment when you make the right decision are a hair's breadth apart. I can't resist telling you a little war story from my family mediation time. Some of my students might have heard this, but I once found myself mediating between a man and a woman, and there was an issue. The man wanted to see his children on certain dates, and the woman was being very hazy about why he couldn't. No, they're not available. You can't see them. You can see them before, you can see them after, you can't see them. And she was really kind of obfuscating, I think. And he kept saying, well, why not? What's going on? What's going on? And the woman caught my eye, and he was maybe looking away. He wasn't looking at her. And she mouthed the words, "I'm going on holiday." To me. I hope you could hear that. She said, "I'm going on holiday." But she just mouthed the words and then looked away. And in that instant, I had to decide what to do with that information. And I made the wrong choice. The man said to me, "What did she say?" And I said, "I can't tell you that." No, that mediation failed. It went downhill from there because that loss of trust drove a stake really through the heart of the work that we were doing. I mean, just for those of you who are wondering what I think I should have done, I think what I should have done is said, "I'm sorry, what did you say?" Yes, Craig as well. That would have been enough. Anyway, but what I'm saying is the ethics of mediation are often like that. They're very microcosmic decisions, and so I think we learn more about how we want to be when we're dealing with real people in real situations where the emotional stakes are high. And then I think my final point probably combines those two. I'm going to use the word salience. It makes it count. Again, role play counts because you're on show and you're being marked usually and all of these things, but there's something about this is going to have consequences for the people that you're dealing with. That really does count. And so for all of these reasons, they were big drivers for me in starting the clinic. And then finally, I should not forget, there was an urge and there is an urge for us to do something useful, to be a service to society. The fact that we're able to offer a free service has been, I think, quite helpful, quite distinctive. We've had some questions about should we charge, and I'm not completely against it. I suspect we would never charge for the smallest claims, those at the lower end of the values system. But there's something about the service society which was a trigger as well. So those were the triggers for this mediation clinic. And anyone who's thinking of starting a clinic, I'm sure you'll have your own. Oh, I had another. I should be looking at my sheet that tells me what's coming up. And there's a quote from Janet Walker, an academic who studied family mediation. Settling disputes is kind of lawyers' term. Lawyers talk about dispute resolution. Managing conflict is a wider societal task, and I think the clinic is aiming to do both. Let's move on before I completely run out of time. I want to talk about the environment. Now, I don't want to do this in a spirit of boastfulness. It's a spirit of gratitude and actually luck again. I didn't know this. Strathclyde is just one of the universities in the city I live in. It's not the one I went to, but I did know somebody there. But once I had made the proposal for a master's, I discovered that Strathclyde University is host to a very, very well-established law clinic. And there's the latest figures from the law clinic. So it gives you some idea of how significant that is. And so again, for anyone thinking of starting a clinic, there was something about that environment which made it easier for me and made it easier for the institution to think about, well, what does a clinic look like? What does it need? And also to feel supported, to feel this is an activity that I don't need to justify. And even further back, some of you might know that Strathclyde University started something called the Glasgow Graduate School of Law, which was a temporary partnership with the University of Glasgow up the road. And that was an approach to legal education based on, they had a very interesting system in the 90s where they were using a village, an online, a virtual village called Ard Cailach, I think it was called. And in effectively using, again, learning by doing, using what would look like a role play to us mediators for lawyers to enable them to work on legal problems. So I found myself in an environment that understood that we need to take academic ideas and make them real and make them practical in order for students to actually do something beyond academia. And the one consequence of that, and here's my environment slide number 2, the room. That's the clinic room. You might recognize Patrick from the opening on the right. And that was just, again, a very important symbol before the pandemic, that we had a place. You might notice we did the best we could. Of course, I wanted a round table. We did the best we could. We got 6 little tables that slot together, and we've got a hexagonal table. But that was another piece of institutional endorsement. It said that we were supported. It told the public that we were formal and we were official. Okay, I think that's enough about the environment. I want to turn to the people we serve. The justice system is, of course, not the only place where conflict happens, and we might well have looked elsewhere. We did, in fact, talk to the law clinic, and we did some mediating, very, very little. I have to say that the people who ran the law clinic got it immediately and thought mediation would be helpful, but the students found it difficult in particular cases to imagine mediating being useful to their clients. I've said in the article, to a hammer everything looks like a nail. Every case looks suitable for litigation, of course, because that's how lawyers are trained. So by luck, again another piece of luck, I met a judge, a very nice man called Sheriff Platt, in 2013, and he rather quietly said to me, "Do you think you could help with my small claims?" I said, "Yeah, I think we could." And a few months later, we were sat at the back of his court in this building, this rather intimidating looking building in Glasgow. It is a criminal and civil court, I have to say that, and that makes it all the more daunting for the civil claimants who are arriving. I've put the word relationships up because I've learned that working with the justice system is actually all about the people, not the buildings. I've now been in that building. I've now been on the top floor where the sheriffs, those are what we call judges, live, and they're humans. They're worrying about, how do we do this? How do we make the most of this? So those relationships were very, very significant to us, I think, and working with administrators. Being in the court was very useful for the first couple of years. I think it gave us a feel for the way things are done, and it gave a sense of endorsement, and I would recommend that. Who knows what the future holds? We haven't been in court for a year. And the other dimension is, another R is reform. We have been very lucky in Scotland to be beneficiaries of our reform. In 2016, there's a Scottish statutory instrument for the lawyers among you. And the key, the key phrase, excuse me, which keeps popping up throughout this piece of secondary legislation, is that for the first time in Scotland, the court rules say that people are to be encouraged to settle their disputes. There's the magic words, negotiation or alternative dispute resolution. When it comes to alternative dispute resolution, it was clear, I think, to a lot of the sheriffs that mediation was the most obvious choice. And we were approached immediately by the senior judges, they're called sheriff's principal, in 2 parts of Scotland, and so they said, "Can you help?" So just to move on with the story, did it make any difference? Well, yes, up until those rules came in, we were mediating around about 25 cases a year, which was helpful and was good for the students that did it. After the rules came in, that jumped. We were then operating across 7 sheriff courts. We received in the last year before the pandemic 156 referrals. It was actually 200 the year before. We mediated 60 matters and 44 of them settled. So that has become a more significant caseload, and that's really riding a wave of law reform. We have Margaret Mitchell, MSP, speaking to us later, just after me actually, about further efforts at law reform, because I think that's illustrated a very, very simple point. Judges respect rules. And judges are the supreme gatekeepers in the justice system. So if you change the rules, you change the system. And it's been a really interesting exercise. I need to say, and to follow up on Patrick's introduction, then came March 2020. Richard Susskind, who's been thinking about online law for nearly 40 years now, a Glasgow graduate, called it a huge unscheduled pilot. We suddenly found ourselves, all the courts were closed. And I have to be honest and say nothing happened at all till July. We were ready for online mediation in April, but the courts took a wee while in Scotland to get going. However, mediation looks like this now, doesn't it? You know, it looks the same as what you're doing. When I mediate, it doesn't look very different from what I'm doing now. In fact, that doesn't look very different from when I'm teaching. And in the last, Pauline's given me the figures, 4 months, We've now had referrals from 11 sheriff courts, soon to be 16, because another sheriffdom has asked if we can help them. So there's one interesting thing. The geographical boundaries have been reduced. We've had 92 referrals, 28 mediations. So the number actually mediating has not yet picked up, and 15 of those have settled. It also seems to be a reasonably tough neighbourhood, online mediation, although the settlement rate varies from setting to setting, and I won't even name the places where it seems to be difficult, but I suspect that'll pick up. That was the experience of face-to-face mediation. So that's where we are. So let's turn from the setting to, oh no, sorry, I've forgotten one more slide. We are now in this strange new world where people are writing genuine academic articles about this, mediating in your jammies, that what does the future hold? I don't think we know. Patrick tells me, though, that he has recently started polling his clients in one of the sheriff courts that we work in, who've already mediated remotely. Some of it's via Zoom, some of it's on the phone, actually, and Patrick's been a great champion of telephone mediation. And he's asked them, if you had the choice of face-to-face or remote mediation in the future, which would you choose? And apparently so far, I think 10 out of 11 said, or 11 out of 12 said that they would be happy with the online version. So that's really interesting for the future. What the future holds, we don't know. I suspect we won't go back to everything being the way it was, and that will have implications for us all. I should probably acknowledge that we have 2 former students at least, in fact more, 3, who are mediating from other continents via the wonders of Zoom as part of the mediation clinic. And we're delighted, and that's fantastic that that can happen. So it has changed many, many things. I want to finish by talking about the model. All of this has to actually happen. What does a clinic look like? What do we do on the ground? And let me just get my next PowerPoint. Yes, so lead and student. So one of the components, as soon as I started thinking about operating in real cases, there was a clear moral imperative that you can't expose real people with real problems to an absolute beginner. That's simply not fair. That would seem wrong. Not fair on the beginner as well as not fair on the people. So from the start, we had this lead and student mediator model. The lead, at the beginning, they were my pals, experienced mediators who volunteered, who offered very kindly to sit in the court and do the mediation. And they do act in a mentor capacity to the student mediator. As time has gone on, more and more of the student mediators are now lead mediators. Sorry, more and more of the lead mediators are formerly student mediators. But that model, we're very, very committed to. Excuse me, it allows the building of confidence. It allows somebody who's new to this, the very first mediation, we tend to all be quite wide-eyed. Wow, is this what happens? And then after 2 or 3 or 4 cases, the lead mediator will often step back and the student will do more and more, and it becomes more of a co-mediation. And when people have the confidence, and I observe that they're ready, they can become lead mediators too. So that model has been really important for us, not only internally, but in terms of our credibility with the courts. They are entrusting to us these significant matters. They need to know that they're in the hands of a professional person. I'm also, you won't be surprised to hear after what I said earlier, very committed to the idea of reflective practice. I no longer have Moira, sadly, she's retired, to chat to, but I do think there's a lot to be said for every mediator writing something. And so those are the rules in the clinic. When you're finished, you fill out this form. I'm sure it's a chore that people don't necessarily relish. and both people contribute. Sometimes the lead mediator writes it and the student contributes. Sometimes the student writes it and the lead contributes. You'll see at the bottom right hand side, we've built in a part for me to react. I started writing emails because some of them are terribly interesting, and we should capture that as well. So you've got this opportunity to chew over what you're doing and take your learning from it. And of course, we as Clinic are building our learning from it. And all of that, I think, has led to, maybe this is slightly more controversial, my own pitch here. I'm doing research at the same time as running the clinic. I'm still doing a PhD. You're all saying, surely you're too old to be doing a PhD. And yes, you're right, I am, but I just can't quite get it finished. But I've done all the research. One of the things I've learned from that is that people who go through mediation welcome a mediator who is quite activist. Now, that diagram is maybe a bit crude. I don't necessarily mean biased. In fact, I don't mean biased at all. I think what I mean is in balancing the information, balancing the awareness that the parties in the room have. It's not uncommon for one of the people in the room to be a repeat player. We get property factors who are using the courts all the time. We sometimes have businesses. We sometimes have lawyers who are representing large utilities. The other person in the room is what's called a one-shotter. They have one shot at this. They're there for the first time. They don't know a lot of things. And I think that diagram does illustrate that what people really welcome, including the repeat player, I have to say, is a mediator who's calm, clear and confident about, here's what will happen next. Here's how the court approaches this kind of thing. Are you aware about the rules of evidence, that you're going to have to lodge any written evidence 2 weeks before the case if you're going to go to a hearing? Do you know about anything about the hearing? Do you know anything about the timescales? So that is mostly what I mean by the activist mediator. They go further than that. They will also say to people, what are you going to do to try and reach a resolution today? And sometimes they might say there's a gap. How are we going to bridge that gap? I think these are all signs of an activist mediator. I am not using the term evaluative mediator, please hear me loud and clear. That's a different debate. I'm not suggesting that our mediators are evaluating who's going to win and who's going to lose. They're using their legal and process and situational knowledge and the fact that they're repeat players to help the parties have a more informed and therefore more fairer and more equal dialogue with each other. So I think I would remain very committed to the activist mediator model. I mean, just for those of you who wonder what I'm talking about, I think this is kind of what it looks like in practice, that you'll see I've got the decision coming from the parties, but I think the mediator often has some input, not least in writing it up. In our case, it should be 2 mediators. But these are the sort of factors, I think, that in reality are coming into play when people are making their choices in mediation. What would the courts do? Clearly, that's part of it. So the law does matter. But what can you live with? And what will your family think? What will your partner think? These things do matter to people. I learned from my doctoral studies, that one on the right, what does this say about you? Is actually really significant to people. More than I expected. When I asked people what happened, the question they often answered was, I'm a fair person. I'm the kind of person who. And so I think we're working with all of those complex things when we're doing court mediation. I'm certainly more than happy to say to the sheriffs that I don't regard clinic mediators as passive. There are different styles. I should acknowledge this. Some of us, I've learned this by teaching for a few years, that there are many, many different personalities who can be really, really effective mediators. Some of us are very lippy, like me. I ask a lot of questions. Some are much quieter, very effectively. And they help people to resolution. So I don't mean that an activist mediator is necessarily somebody who's talking all the time, but I do think it's somebody who has the confidence to bring their own sense of the setting into play if people need that. I'm just going to, I say I've tried to make it look like we're not systematic. I just can't resist finishing with a couple of slides that were prepared by my colleague Catherine Brees. We had a brainstorming session around my kitchen table, and she reminded me of it late last night, that this is one of the slides that came out of it. So there we are in 2018. It turns out we actually did have a strategy, and that idea of bringing society into academia, bringing academia into society. And again, for those of you who are thinking of starting a clinic, there's the list of stakeholders, which was actually, it was a very helpful list for us. In fact, for the board, I might bring this back to the board because some of them are still neglected. And in fact, at the end of the whole list, I realized we didn't actually put the consumers. For all that huge long list, we managed to miss the very people who are probably the most important stakeholders. But it gives you some idea of the potential of a clinic and the potential for work, that it takes mediation into the world. Now, I'm going to stop at that. Actually, it's 10 to. I'll take a couple of questions just to wrap up. Then back to my city of Glasgow. What the clinic has taught me is that mediation is something people like better after they've done it. Okay, it's a very old truth, and therefore talking about it, enthusing about it in the absence of experience is a really thankless task. I'm sure many of you in this group will have had that experience of saying, do you know, mediation might be a good idea. And seeing those blank faces or worried faces or concerned faces, or people saying, yeah, but I just don't think it would work for us. People who've done it are in quite a different position and are generally very, very positive about it and very positive about the mediators. So I think one of the things the clinic seems to be doing is making mediation salient to the justice system. It's bringing it to mind when judges now in our court system who have done the simple procedure matters, that's up to £5,000, when they move up through the system, when they become sheriffs, they're now going to have a lived experience of referring matters to mediation. I think that's very different from an abstract thing. And so I think that's my final pitch, is that more by luck than by judgment, we find ourselves providing a useful service. And I think that is an extraordinary motivation. I have to finish by saying huge thanks to the volunteers, the hours and hours and hours that people put into this mediation clinic. It wouldn't work without them. And I think that in itself says something about the nature of mediation, of the mediation game. So I think with that, I'll probably stop. It's been it's been a joy really to be involved in all of this, and I look forward to more, and I certainly look forward to more mediation clinics in other parts of the world. Thank you. I'll stop screen sharing.
So, Charlie, at this point, are you open to getting a few questions? So I've got three. I've grouped one together because there was a lot of demand around one question. So you've got a few minutes for each. And the first one is quite practical. So what are the ongoing costs of running the mediation clinic?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I wonder if one of the university administrators is sitting in the somewhere quietly with their screen off. It's slightly tricky to put my finger on it, but I think, if I'm honest, so there's, to be blunt, 200 hours a year of my time, whatever that is. So I don't think I want to put a number on that, but that's, I'm not full-time it's quite a big chunk, probably about a day a week, maybe a wee bit under a day a week. We have some of Pauline's time. Pauline's an administrator in the law school, but she's the clinic administrator. So there are some hours of her time which are absolutely key. Without that, I think it would be impossible for the clinic to function the way it does. We also have a room. I'm told that lovely room costs the university somewhere about £8 a year, but don't quote me on that. I might be making that up. So you get the idea. It's probably some thousands for the institution, I think, if an institution is thinking about this. And when that American model I was telling you about, that guy I met at the conference, at the competition, he was the full-time mediation clinic director. So you can, there's a Californian university is paying an entire academic salary. Now that would be lovely. So, you know, there's a Rolls-Royce version. I would love either to do that or to have someone else do that. But at the moment, it's a wee bit on a shoestring. It's certainly not without cost.
Okay, thank you very much. I forgot to actually introduce myself to everyone. So I finished the Masters in 2016. I'm actually originally from the UK, but now I live in Canada. And I engaged back in the mediation clinic because of COVID. So I'm one of the stories that Charlie talked about. Okay, so the second question, I've kind of grouped it together. And it's around the practicalities of the mediation and the students. So there were questions around, like, what is the process for the student to be involved in the mediation, to be involved in the clinic? So how does that work, as in how do they start, and then when they can maybe become a lead mediator? So when do you determine that they're ready? And somebody also said, how do you measure the success and the results of the student? And then also beyond that, like when they finish the Masters, are they capable to do mediations on their own? And is that maybe something you can answer?
They're all connected questions.
Yeah, so, exactly.
The simple answer is no one is eligible to be a student mediator in the clinic until they've passed 2 of the Masters modules. And they are called Theory and Principles of Conflict Resolution and Mediation in Practice. And all my students know them both. They work side by side. Once people have passed those 2, they've got the same level of qualification as somebody who'd done a practical mediation course. There are many practical mediation courses that last 40 hours, and Scottish Mediation has accredited our 2 modules as the equivalent of that. So effectively, it's like getting your L plate, I suppose. At that point, you can start. Then it's a wee bit flexible. We've set a number of 5 as a rough guide after co-mediating some 5 cases. I try to observe, we don't always manage to. Some people, it's because the lead mediator is saying this person's great and they're fine. Other people will actually get to the end of 5 cases and say, I'm not ready. Can I do some more as a co-mediator? And that's absolutely fine. And we accommodated that many times. So it's a wee bit flexible after that. There is a system of quality, I suppose, to ensure that someone is ready to be a lead mediator. We've had volunteers from outside the clinic, and I have to be a wee bit cautious about this, particularly during the pandemic. At the moment, people like yourself, Sandy, and we've got a chap, Jonathan, in India, they're former Strathclyde students. So on that level of quality assurance and assuring the courts who we're working with, we're more than happy to bring people in. We've had people volunteer for the clinic who've not been connected to Strathclyde locally, and that's been helpful. And we've helped some people work through accreditation until they become registered mediators. We certainly would want to continue to do that, but we'll have to. We're quite cautious about saying, for example, anyone from anywhere can at the moment be a student mediator in the clinic. We don't have the capacity for that at the moment because it requires a degree of supervision and time, and our own students, I guess, are also looking for the practice. Did that answer most of that, Sandy? I don't know if I've missed.
No, I think you got most of the points. I think I think you got most of the points. And in terms of it might be just worth sharing about like how do they reflect and the supervisor aspect of it.
Yes, so as well as the mediator reflections that I showed you, and of course the chance to talk to your lead mediator, which I think is a key part of this, we do have sessions. That's been before we had the joys of Zoom. Not so many people turned up to the peer support sessions. Since Zoom came along, that's worked better. We also have some peer role play sessions for people who felt rusty, and that's been really useful, or people who wanted to get practice on Zoom. We also have a CPD program. I don't know if I should go on, Sandy, but I suppose I should say that. That's been really important. We have a joint CPD event with the Edinburgh Sheriff Court Service twice a year. So we're coming together with another court service that's more established than us. And that's been really helpful, sharing knowledge. At the beginning, they shared lots of documents with us. And I should say that I'm very, very open to sharing documents with anyone who would like to start a mediation clinic.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm sure some people will be interested in that. And this is the last question, and you've just got a few minutes to answer it. So it was, to what extent is the emotional intelligence included in the teaching and training of students as future mediators?
That's a really good question. Overtly as a topic to pass, I suppose it's not. We do talk about it, and there's some reading on it, but the improvement in one's emotional intelligence, I think I would have to say, has got to come from the work and from the reflection. My own reading around emotional intelligence would suggest that practicing as a mediator might be one of the best ways of improving it. Because, in fact, I'll go further and say practicing as a mediator on Zoom is really unique because you get feedback on yourself. Because true emotional intelligence is actually the capacity not only to read the emotions of others, it's to understand your own emotional condition and to modify it. And that requires an accurate reading of it, which it turns out we're not all very good at. So I think mediation is a setting where we're actually getting a lot of feedback about ourselves. We're having to monitor ourselves because of the setting, and we've got a co-mediator. So I suppose I'd make an argument. No, it's not taught. I think it's hugely important. I couldn't agree more. And I think there's an argument for saying it's something that we acquire as we go and can learn through the practice.
Okay, thank you very much. And that's it for now.